from the
Oh,
region.
that's smart.
81% of the world's oil reserves are located in OPEC countries, and over 60% of the
81?
world's
You
oil
kidding me?
passes through the Arabian Sea alone.
Oh
The
my
US's
gosh.
strategic goals
Wow.
would be simple. Shut off the global oil tap. With
Man,
the world's
if you
12th
know the
largest oil
statistics,
reserves,
you can
the
like
United States
plan
could
very,
easily
very
supply itself
smart,
while denying
you know,
the
your
rest of the
strategy.
world access.
What's up, team? Have you ever wondered what would happen if USA Army would be in a war against the whole world? Well, if not, it's a great chance to find it out. I'm gonna react to a documentary called The USA States Against the World, Who Would Win. So let's go to the action.
A superpower is defined as a state with the ability to exert influence or project power on a global scale, and if needed, in more than one region of the globe at a time. The
Well,
United
you say
States,
superpower
currently the
for
world's
sure then.
sole superpower, fits this description, with an official
Okay.
military doctrine that states its military forces must be ready and capable to fight two major theater wars simultaneously, a capability no other nation on Earth can even approach. But what would happen if the United
USA
States found
can.
itself in a war against the entire rest of the world?
Because in my opinion, USA have a very good navy, very good air forces, one of the best air forces in the world, if not the best air force in the world. And I remember they have 1,004,000 people who is like signed on the contracts in army. So basically, soldiers. 1,400,000 is third in the world. So
How would that
after
war
India and
potentially play
North
out?
Korea, of
The
course.
rules of this war game will be as follows. No nuclear weapons allowed, and war will be simulated to have broken out after weeks of preamble. As in a surprise attack, the United States with its forces spread around the world would likely lose its non-homeland forces entirely, but not before delivering crippling blows to most of the world's major powers and knocking them out of the conflict early. The US's main opposition would be in the form of a European coalition to include Russia and a China-India alliance. The rest of the world's contribution would be mostly in material supplies or financial backing, as while even nations like Japan boast a formidable military capability, they mostly lack the ability to actually deploy that power outside of their own borders. In
Why
fact,
is that?
That would be the biggest hurdle to any global offensive
Japan has very good technology, that's for
against
sure.
the United States. With historical military preparations focused on conflicts such as NATO versus Russia or China versus India, most militaries around the world lack the ability to
China
transport
versus
military
India?
hardware across the oceans.
Haven't
in a
heard about
meaningful
this
quantity,
conflict.
making a decisive assault against the US homeland impossible. Meanwhile, due to its commitments to fighting wars well outside its own borders for the last 80 years, the United States operates the world's largest air and naval transport fleets that number in the hundreds of ships and aircraft, more than most modern nations combined. This lack of mobility will prove to be a major weakness for the global alliance and severely hinder their ability to respond to US actions. Today, the United States operates its forces in every geographic area.
Yeah,
of the
they're
world
literally
and has split its
everywhere,
command structure
basically.
into 9
Russia
commanding
hates it.
commands,
Russia
6
hates that US are having bases all over the world. They are like really angry about that. They would like to
responsible
have
for
it.
geographic areas of responsibility. In the weeks leading up to the outbreak of war, the United States would likely pull its forces out of Europe and non-American bases in the Pacific, disbanding its European, African, and Southern commands. Pacific Command, Northern Command, and Central Command would
Man, when America was pulling out from Afghanistan, they left behind so many equipment, man. So many like Humvees, guns. Like I even think maybe even like semi tanks, you know, something like that. But a lot.
absorb these forces. Battlefield 1, Middle East. U.S. Central Command would receive an influx of former European assets, with the U.S. bolstering its forces in the Middle East and bases in Afghanistan and Iraq with one goal: destroying the major oil refineries and distribution centers while denying access to the sea lanes that transport oil from the
Oh,
region.
that's smart.
81% of the world's oil reserves are located in OPEC countries, and over 60% of the
81?
world's
You
oil
kidding me?
passes through the Arabian Sea alone.
Oh
The
my
US's
gosh.
strategic goals
Wow.
would be simple. Shut off the global oil tap. With the
Man,
world's
if you
12th
know the
largest oil
statistics,
reserves,
you can
the
like
United States
plan
could
very,
easily
very
supply itself
smart,
while denying
you know,
the
your
rest of the
strategy.
world access to vital Middle East oil. Europe which would
Russia
represent
has
the
some
United
oil also.
States' most formidable adversary, relies on Middle East oil for 40 to 50% of its total annual use.
That's true.
Meaning an American stranglehold
We don't have
on the
our own
region
oil,
would cripple
unfortunately.
any European war effort as reserves run out and their economies begin to collapse. China would face a similar problem, as 50% of its total oil imports all come from the Middle East, making the region
Oh my
the first
gosh,
front in our war.
50%.
At the
Imagine
outbreak
this
of
to
war, the
to
United
feed
States
the
would first strike
to feed the whole Chinese like machine, you know, because they need oil a lot. They have a lot of people, they have a lot of cars, you know, and to be able to maintain also their army, which is huge. They have huge army. They have to have oil, you know,
oil
to
production and
use
distribution
those
facilities
tanks
across
and
the Middle East
other
by a
vehicles
carrier-based strike aircraft
efficiently.
backed up by former European theater aircraft, now based off American bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. With the world's largest air tanker fleet and flanking the all-important Persian Gulf from both Iraq and Afghanistan, American aircraft could penetrate deep into Middle East territory with impunity, striking at targets from the Straits of Hormuz all the way to the Suez Canal itself. Though regional forces would be able to offer some initial resistance, most operate outdated Soviet-era or non-modern American-built aircraft, with the exception of current US allies such as Saudi Arabia, who would be able to field modern
Oh,
variants
Pakistan
of
has the
F-15s, Typhoon
American
Eurofighters,
planes.
and Italian-British Tornado multi-role strike aircraft in small numbers. Without European support, however, the air war would go very poorly for Middle East powers for several reasons. Firstly, lacking a joint unified command, each nation would be unable to coordinate its air assets with its neighbors, resulting in confusion and low sortie rates. Most Middle East powers
Also, let's not forget that Middle East countries have ideological problems between each other. Basically, they don't like each other a lot.
field very few electronic warfare or early warning and control aircraft. Turkey
I mean, not all of them, but like, let's say they hate, Israel, they don't like, and there's like a lot of conflicts around that.
Saudi Arabia and Israel would represent the most.
But it's, I think it's not the only place where there's conflict in Middle East.
Electronic attack aircraft, while the U.S. is equipped with over 200, mostly F-35 variants and EA-18G Growlers. Without adequate numbers of AWACS and electronic warfare assets, Middle East powers would be unable to coordinate the large amounts of sorties needed to counter U.S. air power, and they'd find their aircraft and ground-based air defenses actively jammed or spoofed by American EW assets. In the opening days of the Middle East War, the US would likely see moderate casualties among its air forces, as it would be mostly operating against obsolete aircraft and disorganized or inexperienced air forces. The greatest threat to US craft would come from ground-based air defenses, which range in obsoletism, yet remain a formidable obstacle to US air power. With a concentration of American power in the region, it's a foregone conclusion that Middle East powers would have begun to move their air defenses to protect vital oil shipping routes and manufacturing/distribution centers. Yet Desert Storm proved how effective the United States can be at dismantling a nation's air defense network, and most nations in the region have invested little into modernizing their defense infrastructures in the years since. The US would suffer most of its losses to its fourth-generation aircraft such as its F-15, F-16, and F-18s, while its fifth-generation F-35
And this is only if US would strike from the air. They are not considering what would happen if US would start a full-scale invasion.
F-35s and F-22s would prove much more difficult to contend with.
Which already happened in Iraq, by the way, and partially in Syria, but it's like partially.
The US retains the only operational fifth-generation air fleets, with current allies fielding a token force of F-35s purchased from America, and the Russians and Chinese still not fielding combat-ready fifth-generation aircraft. Despite its technological and operational superiority, however, sheer numbers would present a threat to American forces. So instead of seizing key oil production or distribution facilities, the US would instead focus its efforts on keeping those facilities and trade route choke points shut down while defending against attacks on its air bases. A single
okay,
supertanker
nice plan,
could
nice
block
plan.
the Suez Canal for weeks, shutting down one of the most important oil trade routes in the world, while constant harassment by American air power would make the Straits of Hormuz impassable.
I guess one of the ways how to shut down Suez Canal would be like catch a timing when a ship was passing, a big ship was passing through the canal and just like bombard it, so it would get blocked. The canal would get blocked, you know, by the ship.
Naval threats in the Pacific, American Pacific naval forces would be split between containing China and bolstering U.S. Central Command forces in establishing a blockade of trade routes across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. With 20 carriers, 11 of which are super carriers, more than the rest of the world combined, a blockade of the Indian and Pacific Oceans would be easily achieved. With a staggering 80% of global oil trade passing through the Indian and Pacific Oceans, the rest of the world would be forced to abandon any plans to attack the US homeland and first try to dislodge the Americans from the Middle East.
Man, it's so smart, man.
While operating on a ticking clock
So smart.
as domestic oil reserves begin running dry. In a prolonged conflict, immediate development of oil reserves in Russia would begin, though with only 80 billion barrels of proven reserves versus over 800 billion in the Middle East.
Wow.
For the global
10
coalition
times
to dislodge the US from the region
less
or face
than in
eventual oil
the
starvation
Middle East
and
Russia
defeat.
has.
Europe would be faced with the difficult decision of committing the majority of its air and naval power to a Middle East campaign, yet with an American navy larger than the next 8 navies in the world combined, they would be doing so at the risk of leaving their coasts vulnerable to harassment from American attack submarines and carrier strike groups. American attack submarines in particular would prove to be an overwhelming force, with 55 nuclear attack subs alone.
Wow,
Europe,
55,
to
man,
include
that's a
Russia,
lot.
fields nearly 100
You can blow up
submarines,
whole world
yet only
with
about a third of
this
those
amount
were
of like
nuclear-powered
nuclear
and range from
submarines.
10 to 25 years behind US subs in tech. Lacking in major transport
By the way, guys, can you help me to blow up my channel by clicking like, subscribing, and clicking the bell, which is very important to get notified by new videos, and leave your comments in the comment section. What do you think? Would United States stand a chance against the world?
capabilities and the ability to adequately protect either their sea lanes or any attempts to move troops by sea, the global coalition would be extremely hard-pressed to dislodge the US from the Middle East. While an eventual overwhelming of US ground forces would be possible, it would take weeks of buildup and slow moving of forces via ground routes to avoid American submarines. Victory in the Middle East would be possible for the global coalition, but would only come at great expense of dwindling oil reserves, and any attempts to reopen the Middle East trade routes would certainly fail, as the US would concentrate its nuclear attack subs and carrier battle groups in the region. The coalition would be forced to rely on existing land-based pipelines, though these would not be enough to sustain the world economy.
They are
and the
like
United States would
easier to
certainly
destroy
commit
them
its
because they are
stealthy
very
B-2
long.
bombers to the destruction of these pipelines and any attempts at building new ones. In short, a land victory would be probable for the global coalition, but without the ability to challenge the US Navy, global trade routes would be permanently shut down, effectively crippling
What about the
economies
English
of
Navy?
coalition
Back in the day,
nations
English
and
had the
war effort.
biggest navy in the
Battlefield 2,
world.
West Pacific.
What's happening
The
now,
West
I
Pacific
wonder.
and South China Sea is the most economically important waterway in the world, with a full 1/3 of all global trade passing through the area, or about $5.3 trillion.
1.3 trade. Oh my god. Wow. Man, this documentary is surprising me with every second.
In a global war, the United States would invest the majority of its expeditionary firepower in the West Pacific, having little to fear from an Atlantic incursion by European powers due to their lack of major military transport capability and navies designed for decades to engage Russian ships in literal combat rather than blue water operations. Japan would pose a significant challenge for US forces due to its very modern and robust self-defense forces, yet the island nation could be largely ignored due to Japan's lack of air tankers, limiting the range of its strike aircraft and 70-year self-defense military doctrine, which saw the nation only recently begin to build an expeditionary capability. With 155 F-15s making up the bulk of Japan's air force and only a combat range of 790 miles, it is doubtful the island nation
Japan is
would
not the
risk its
same
five
as in World War
operational
II.
airborne refueling tankers to attempt offensive operations against the US Navy and its over 1,000 fighter aircraft, instead holding its air forces in reserve in case of an American attack on the homeland. The US
Man, Americans are so ready to attack and to protect their land. Man, this is crazy how much money they are putting in into the navy, into the air forces, you know, into the land force, like into the whole army. Man, this is mad.
would be to cut off
This
all
is
trade
crazy.
routes passing through the South China Sea. China would represent the US's biggest global adversary, yet like every other global power, to include
China
Russia,
has big
it too
amount of
lacks the Navy
people,
and the transport
big quantity
capability
of
to
people.
actually threaten the US homeland. In order to deny the nation the opportunity to build this capability, the US would immediately move to cut off Chinese trade through the South China Sea, something China would be particularly vulnerable to as over 60% of its trade is delivered by sea. Though China
Also, China has not been in any global conflict. Like, I don't even remember last time when they were in global conflict. Maybe in World War II or something like that. And it was long time ago. So basically, Chinese army is not getting the fight experience, you know, like US is getting, because US is all over the globe in all the hotspots of the world, you know. And for China, for Chinese soldiers without experience, it's going to be very hard to fight against more experienced US army.
lacks a navy formidable enough to threaten US Pacific forces, it more than makes up for this shortcoming with its ballistic missile forces. Its DF-26 ballistic missiles each have a range of 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers and would threaten any US base or ship as far out as Guam. At the outbreak of war, China would immediately launch a withering missile strike against American facilities on Guam. While Guam would be defended by THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Missile Systems, Aegis-equipped destroyers and Patriot missile batteries, China would rely on heavy saturation strikes and overwhelm American missile defense systems.
Does China have nuclear power, by the way? Guys, please comment in the comment section. May somebody know, does China have a nuclear bombs or rockets?
Naval assets in the region, which would be the secondary targets of China's opening.
I know India have,
long touted as carrier
if I'm not
killers,
wrong. India,
China's
Russia,
DF-26
America,
and
United Kingdom.
DF-21 ballistic missiles each rely on a very long and complex kill chain, or chain of military assets required to recon a target, track it, and guide a missile to it. In order to accomplish this, China operates 30 Yaogan tracking and reconnaissance satellites grouped into constellations that, working together, would
wow.
provide China 16
Man, those satellites are game changer, I'm telling you.
Target a US Navy vessel to within
Just imagine how we went from like World War I, where people were sitting in trenches and just shooting artillery at each other, to this, where we have like flying robots in the sky who are tracking down the rockets to shoot them down with other rockets, man. How crazy is that? I mean, like, mind-blowing. This is mind-blowing what human potential is, man. Man, this is crazy how technology has developed over the years also. This is mad.
The US would certainly seek to counter this capability with deployment of its anti-satellite weapon systems, of which it remains extremely secretive about. It is impossible to infer just how effective US anti-sat weapons truly are due to a lack of information, but it is known that in the early 2000s, the US Air Force successfully tested a deployment of mini-sats designed to kill or hijack enemy satellites, and in 2008, the US successfully targeted and destroyed a defunct satellite with an SM-3 missile launched from the USS.
So soon they will invent satellites who destroy other satellites and protect from being destroyed, you know. It's gonna be, you know, because they're gonna probably they're gonna put AI into it somehow. I don't know.
Could potentially pose a serious threat to Chinese space assets and degrade the capabilities of their ballistic missile forces. In a push into the Pacific, however, the US would still suffer heavy casualties among its fleet due to Chinese long-range missile strikes. It's probable then that while it works to destroy Chinese space assets from afar, America would instead send its nuclear attack submarine fleet to blockade Chinese waters. China operates about 60 submarines, yet for years, those subs did not go on patrols or even leave port as they were often sidelined.
It's a big problem from China. I'm telling you, China has a big amount of soldiers, right? The army is big, but it's not so experienced as the USA army is.
Due to their noisy nature. Defense experts estimated that Chinese sub-technology was 10 years behind Russia and about 20 years behind the US.
Wow, man, they're very old.
55 nuclear attack submarines, with most of these being of the modern Virginia class. Armed with torpedoes and a complement of Tomahawk cruise missiles, Virginia attack subs could easily threaten Chinese surface and subsurface vessels.
By the way, guys, first submarine was invented in American Civil War.
and join its Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines in
I hope
cruise
I'm
missile
not wrong.
attacks against Chinese inland industrial and military installations. While in recent years, China has invested heavily into improving its anti-submarine warfare capabilities, it is still critically behind even regional powers such as South Korea and Japan, meaning that in the end, there is likely little China could do to stop US attack subs. Though it could likely keep American carrier battle groups out of the South China Sea for the first week or two of the war, China would be helpless to prevent a naval blockade by
Yeah,
US
man.
attack
If you
subs.
if you
India,
miss
also
only
reliant
one
on South Pacific trade routes,
from the
would
three,
certainly
right?
dispatch its naval
Navy,
forces to attempt to
land
break the
forces,
US
and
blockade,
air.
but would
If you
face
have
the
only,
same
let's say,
issues
land
when
forces
challenging
and
US
air,
subs
and you
that
miss
China
like
would,
a navy,
having only 15
you have
active
deep
submarines
trouble.
and
The
also
same with
lacking
like
modern
the same if you
anti-submarine
miss
warfare
one
capabilities, the
out of
Indian Navy would quickly
three of
find
them.
itself overpowered by American attack subs.
You need to
Employing
have
a
all three of
combination
them to
its
be very
submarine
powerful,
and
to be
anti-satellite
powerful,
assets,
superpower.
The US would likely break through the Chinese ballistic missile shield within 30 days and enact a complete blockade of the South Pacific, strangling regional powers.
What you gonna do now,
economically.
China?
With a blockade of Middle East oil exports, the global
West
war would then
Coast.
become a war of attrition, with the US
Yeah.
starving out the world's major powers while able to sustain itself off its own domestic oil reserves. Having little to fear from a European transatlantic offensive
Oh,
due to Europe's lack
USA
of
is so
military
lucky with the
transport
location, man.
capabilities, American forces
'Cause
would
they
be
have
free to
oil
initiate ground defensives against
and other,
Canada and Venezuela in order to seize
resources.
its oil reserves as well. Ultimately, the US Navy, the largest and best equipped in the world, would be the deciding factor in a global war. With such overwhelming firepower superiority, the United States would be able to fight defensively and without launching any major ground defensives outside of North America. Fielding a larger fleet than the next 8 navies combined, the US Navy, backed by the US Coast Guard, could easily defend the Atlantic sea lanes from any European incursion while enacting blockades of major oil shipping routes through the Persian Gulf and Indian and Pacific Oceans. While the world would eventually be able to muster a large enough force to threaten the US, current military capabilities across the globe would be insufficient to prevent these naval blockades and would require years of buildup and expansion of navies from every modern nation. With the majority of global oil trade shut off by naval blockade, however, European and Asian economies would quickly shrink or outright collapse, making such a buildup improbable and ensuring an eventual US victory. Yet that victory would come at a titanic cost to even the US's own economy, and in the end, the entire global economy would likely shrink to levels not seen since the end of the Second World War.